right, well, welcome, gentlemen. This is going to be the third episode in our exploration of the possibilities of a sacred naturalism. And today our themes are going to be, at least nominally, we're going to launch into it and see where we go, but nominally we're going to explore shamanism and its nature, but also its implications for modern metapsychology. Gregg is now involved in a new series on metapsychology that takes transformation seriously with Zach Stein and John Vervaeke, and it's a great conversation so far. So I think, and I hope what we're exploring here will be complementary to what's unfolding in that series. So I'll talk a little bit about my understanding of shamanism, particularly in relationship to transpersonal psychology and some of the ways it's manifesting now. And Layman also has a take on that, where what the relevance of shamanism is for the themes that we're going to be exploring in our talk today. And then we'll just see where it goes after that. So anything you'd like to say just by way of introduction first, Layman?
Yeah, I can do an opening rant. First of all, hello, darlings. Good to see you again.
Hey, good to be back.
What I want to focus on is something I consider to be a crucial part of sacred naturalism that I call planetary shamanism. And what I mean by that is a transcultural, future-oriented use of the figure of the shaman to exemplify the sociological extensions of normative metapsychology, and specifically in a way that affords a high-grade ecological savvy, wisdom cultivation, restorative, diverse health, and transformational opportunities, as well as maybe the surplus energy and meaningfulness necessary to mobilize for those things.
Love it.
So that's generally where I'm coming from, but I'd like to take a minute and frame a couple of general things up front. When I say metapsychology, I'm thinking it through the lens of the metaphysics of adjacency, but I'm also looking at it as having two complementary aspects. The McGill-Christian brain hemispheres of metapsychology.
Good.
Because on the one hand, there's this explanatory topological containment aspect in which metapsychology enfolds the various schools of conventional and cognitive and also religious psychology and holds them in a supportive proximity in a context that validates each of them in a more plural, relational, and an active sense. And then that's all spread over, like Gregg specifies, evolutionary segmentation, giving us these adjacent, slightly overlapping zones of psychology. You know, the behavioral psychology of neuromobile organisms, the zone of justified social sapient agents, and the zone maybe of trans-justificational supersalient mutants.
Yeah.
And then also, of course,
gotta love that. That's why we're here.
That's the one I really like.
I get that sense.
And the other topics like ethics, which are not always seen as part of psychology, but which are right next to it. And so they get enfolded into the larger metapsychological container. And I think that's terrific, and that's desperately needed. And that's something that Gregg's talks with Vervaeke and Stein so far is probing very nicely, I think. The other way of coming at this, the other hemisphere, I think, is a little bit closer to the work that Bruce and I have been engaged in, where we're emphasizing the prepositional structure and the variety of the meta gesturing itself. So that metapsychology is the psychology of the performances of the productive meta motions in interstitial space. So we're privileging the passage beyond as the structural element and then unpacking all the psychologies in terms of how they inhabit dynamic proximal relations.
Beautiful.
And there's a couple of reasons why I think that's really important to look at. One is that it pertains to this philosophical discussion around how theory and methodology are related. So that we have, yes, all kinds of historical narratives about the modern domination by technical methodology, but you know, are theory and methodology alternative emphases, or are they complementary specifications for the production of a generalized theory whose fundamental elements resemble methodology somehow, resemble iterative, dynamic, and active shifts?
Totally.
So, and that could afford us, to use John's word.
I say that all the goddamn time now, John.
It's as bad as adjacency. I'm thinking of the way that the magnetic polarization of atoms can add up to a magnetic material that has this adjacent, has this proximal relation to something like a North Pole. And if we built theory out of those kinds of structures, then we might get an emergent polarization that gives us a evaluation orientation that prescribes a certain normativity over others when it comes to these fields. I don't want to say too much more, but I will say also that the trans-justificational involves these paradoxes of intense adjacency, where seemingly opposite categories are brought very close together. And also the sacred, which we want to include in our naturalistic map, is not just a set of nouns passed down to us, but is sacralizing praxis, which involves learning the gestures of consecration and the gestures of sacralization, which is, I think, where the shamanism comes in, because Mircea Eliade called it the psychotechnology of ecstasy, and it's the ecstasis. You're going to be just next to yourself.
Nice.
And also, I guess there's a fourth thing, not to ramble too much, which is that inquiring of ourselves in relational proximity is quite possibly a very general heuristic that applies across many, if not all, the domains of psychology. So I'm curious about what you guys think about that kind of a distinction. And what I want to do with that in the background is point to what I see as a strong symmetry between the cluster of problems associated with the meaning crisis and the meta crisis, and the clusters of expert subdomains associated with the generalized concept of what shamans do. So that's where I'm coming from. And even though I'm sort of suggesting the shaman, I'm also probably going to be asking and re-asking the question of what is the normative sociological vision appropriate to metapsychology and unified knowledge generally.
Brilliant. Well, I'll just say that resonates across all of the different dimensions. And I look forward to diving a little bit more into your conception of shamanism. But in terms of what happened with the evolution of U-Talk, from concerned with, well, first the embodied practice of psychotherapy, into then the logos architecture of the unified theory, and then natural science, and then the evolution back into a wisdom philosophy that then must be embodied and ultimately sort of culminate in the orientation of a wisdom energy that's trans-justificatory. And then the way to use John's term, participate and afford that in the embodied now, and to do it in a way that, so you live it as opposed to just talk about it. That's the entire thing you have to get from, knowledge and then philosophia into phronesis in particular ways. Absolutely. So to me, the way you're articulating that, if I put it in analytic terms, well, it's a theory, research, practice intersection that affords the genuine embodiment of a philosophy of living that we're after.
One thing I didn't mention in my opening statement was also that we're probably going to get a little bit into sociology. Several people have been pushing at Gregg to expand U-Talk from psychology into sociology. And so I think there's some themes there that we can touch on. I know Wilbur has explored that. And relative to our conversation last time about the centaur, Wilbur suggests that the compound individual, of which a centaur is a more developed version of that, a more integrated version of that, the compound individual is a kind of bridge between psychology and sociology when you understand the levels of the compound individual as systems of relational exchange.
Love it.
And so, yeah, we can get into that as we...
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I've been doing a fair amount of connecting with him. I just talked to Robert Ryan, who's a guy that I've been syncing up with a bit on his world systems theory. I can speak to some of the networking connections that is emerging in social sciences generally, sociology, and then this world systems theory vision. And I think the juxtaposition of that and shamanism and the intersection of all of that affords us a really nice sort of psychogeometric map that shamanism then speaks to in many ways as well. So I look forward to that.
Great. Well, I'm going to just make a couple opening comments about shamanism. In talking to you, Gregg, and approaching this episode, you mentioned that you don't feel that comfortable with shamanism.
But I put this shirt on so that I can drink and know things.
He's got the shirt.
Yeah.
I got this shirt. And I do say now, I mean, what's happened to me the last year is like, fucking, I'm a shaman on a hill. So I'm actually, I think from the body and from the embodiment of it, something's happened to me on this wisdom energy thing.
I think so. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I mailed each of you some tabs of acid. Do you have them? Because I'd like to pop them now.
Now is the time.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a 12-hour episode, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the shaman is a person who mediates between worlds. So there is this meta element, this prepositional element to the shaman that I think is important, and the adjacent quality of the shaman living alongside and between, navigating different kinds of meaning spaces. And I wanted to just kind of frame it from where shamanism is now kind of re-manifesting within psychology, eco-psychology, and transpersonal psychology, just as a modality and a way of being and living that is reasserting its relevance for our time. And what Layman just talked about, he's I think going to unpack it at in a different way around basically the structure of the shaman as a symbol for a way of working rather than necessarily the cultural shaman itself. But just to set it up with the cultural example of shamanism, it's Christina Groff comments that there's something really deeply human about shamanism that almost transcends any other discipline, and that it's a way of working, a way of living, a way of mediating the structures of the human being in relationship to the environment that has survived 40,000 or more years. And it's been in consistent practice in the world across all of that time. So there's a lot of deep wisdom enfolded into that. And I think evolutionarily, it probably wouldn't persist that long unless it was doing something really, I think, relevant to, our own nature and our own way of being in the world. And there are postmodern concerns about maybe speaking too generally about shamans or about indigenous cultures. And I think we do have to be careful about that. There's maybe 350 million indigenous people on the planet right now, and there are many, many, many different cultures. They're not all the same. They don't have the same, presuppositions or models about reality. But there is a deep structure that I think we can legitimately point to, that we should point to, we should acknowledge. And there's a documentary called Fire on the Mountain that is a really interesting, for me, a beautiful example of that. There was a regular interfaith gathering that used to take place. I think it was at a castle or a big building. I think it was a castle that used to regularly take place every few years, and all the major world religions, the big five at least, would show up. And one year they got a letter from some indigenous spiritual leaders and saying, how come we're never invited to this meeting of the world's religions? And so they said, you're right, we should have been inviting indigenous practitioners to this gathering. And in fact, we want to give you 1 week ahead of the official gathering for basically indigenous shamanic practitioners from around the world to have their own pre-conference and then join us in the conference. So they did that. And during that week, shamanistic practitioners from Mongolia, North America, South America, the Finnish Swami, Nepalese Jankri, so many, many different kinds of people from all over the world, African shamanic practitioners, they all gathered together. And they spent basically a week sharing their practices with each other. And to watch the documentary of the way that they interacted with each other and the surprise and the delight that they experienced when they witnessed the deep resonances across all of these cultures in the very deep basic sensibilities about what's important in the world, how do you relate to it, how do you work with emotional systems, how do you work with trauma, how do you establish right relationship with the environment. All of those things were, powerfully demonstrated among all of the groups, that you could clearly recognize that there's a deep human culture that's running through this. And so, to address any postmodern concerns, I don't feel that bad about speaking generally about shamanism on those grounds, that there's deeply a mutual recognition that's already been demonstrated. And, I think there are different, sociological, categories for the medicine person and the witch doctor and the healer, and shaman has its own kind of special category. Sa is the root of the word shaman. It's a Tunguso-Manchurian verb which means to know, and so saman is basically the one who knows.
It means the same as Gnostic.
Right. Yeah, and what sets apart the shaman from something like a witch doctor or something like that is that the shaman especially works with altered states of consciousness in order to facilitate energetic and psychic healing shifts within the individual, to heal different kinds of past traumas, and especially to establish, I think, right relationships both with the environment, with the ancestors, with those who are to come. So there's a way of working with altered states that I think sets it apart as a practice. And it usually involves some kind of shamanic crisis for the individual who becomes a practitioner. They go through a period of positive disintegration and then reintegration, and emerge beside themselves in a new form of being that's more integrated, more highly functioning than they were before the crisis. And it's usually felt that actually recovering from that disintegration, that sacred disintegration, and then the reintegration is what not only empowers you to be a healer, but obligates you to be a healer, because you have been through that passage of destruction and reintegration at usually very, very profound levels of, the shamanic crisis may involve near comatose states and things like that, where the individual totally decompensates and then reconstitutes around a new center of organization. And so, indigenous cultures recognize the shamanic crisis as, it's not absolutely necessary, but it happens. But there's also rites of passage, which are practices of positive disintegration and then reintegration around new identities. And I think we don't really have much of that actively practiced and taught in our culture now. These ways of dying to an old identity and being reborn. We have some more highly abstract formal levels of that, but it doesn't go deeply into the body, into the energy system. So I think that's something to look at. And I'd like to take some time, but not right now. I'll stop right now, but maybe a little bit later to talk about where some shamanic practice is showing up in terms of modern, contemporary practice of healing arts and in psychotherapy. Give a few examples of what's going on there. But that's my setup for now, and I'll pause and pass it over to Layman.
Actually, I'll just make it just a couple of real brief comments, just in terms of,
please.
So if I'm thinking about sort of our elusive I conversation, right, and sort of what's normally happening, you got your experiential self, and then your egoic functioning, and then you're in the conventional way of being in the world. But how do we get past that? And much of what shamanic is a trans-justificatory grip on self-world relation that goes beyond just the conventional learning of being a normal person in the world, right? So if we then put those together, you just basically say, well, how do you get there? Well, actually, the decompensation, dark night of the soul, whatever it is that affords the no longer capacity to reliably predict and to then whatever would trigger the decompensation, but it's a breakdown, a melting of the normal structures of self-world modeling. And then that creates, oh my God, where is the perspective on that? How do you afford understanding the reconstitution of that into then a sage-like trans-justificatory perspective? And then the other thing that you commented about, when shamanist practices get together to see the underlying human nature universals across all those cultures, I think those are unbelievable. If we're going to enter an integrated pluralism of a rooted cosmopolitan in the back half of the 21st century, meaning rooted in where we are, but at the same time cosmopolitan, finding examples of those kinds of people that transcend conventional culture and then do so with a particular kind of resonance across a wide variety of different cultural contexts. That's a beautiful and key point to pay attention to. So at both of those levels, I really appreciate that setup.
Yeah, terrific.
Great.
Well, let me first say that all Indigenous people are wrong and I am correct. No, I really appreciate what you're doing in terms of sort of specifying and singling out shamanism, even distinct from the medicine man and the witch doctor, because I'm going to go the other way with it and really generalize this as a skill set that can be accepted from any cultural tradition and found in a lot of contexts, even among a lot of people who we would not identify with as shamans.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that it's more of a functional process.
I might be a shaman yet, Layman.
There you go. The true shaman. the shaman that can be named is not the true shaman. I think there's obviously a huge amount of attention and respect we need to pay to the people who we think of today as indigenous and as inheriting these prehistoric sources of transformation and healing. But they're also not quite the same as their prehistoric ancestors, and they're not quite the same as what we need in terms of being maybe the new prehistory for a civilization that is waiting to start.
Love it.
So I guess what I would like to do is touching with what I mentioned earlier, the sort of symmetry between some of the categories that feed into the metacrisis and the subdomains of expertise that I associate with a generalized notion of the shaman. And we could get into any of those, but at first I'll just sort of run through some of them, because I think obviously we have an ecological crisis, and then we have a spiritual therapeutic figure that is specifically oriented around ecological settings and practices as an anthropological ecological mediator. Right, we obviously have an educational crisis, but we have this figure that cultivates the psyches of the villagers in challenging ways that are not identical to taking seriously everything that is said in the village. It's a little bit different than what we think of as the teacher today, a more open-ended and depth-oriented kind of education. Right, we have huge problems now around xenophobic aggression and ignorance, both with other people and with non-human intelligences, conventional and unconventional. And then we have this figure who specializes in alien and natural and intertribal communication outside the normal discourse routines. We have a pharmacological crisis and a custodian of pharmacological wisdom, right? We have a need for wisdom generating, culture stabilizing ritual, and we have a character trained to improvise such rituals. Right? We have a need for our philosophy and psychology to take multiple states of consciousness seriously, and we have an ancient sort of basically universal human archetype who is the custodian of state change processes. We have an issue around the modern focus on disembodied abstraction in our system layout, and a figure who specifically represents embodied spirituality. We have a crisis around the ideology of the rational conscious agent, and we have a character who specializes in working with the subconscious and nonlinear. Right, we have irrational community outbursts, and we have a person who should be able to decipher the irrational spirit of the tribe in a way that the chiefs and matriarchs who need to understand what the tribe is doing might not be able to do so on their own. And we have a huge developmental need, and we have this person who, in the way that John Vervaeke connects the imaginal play with ongoing development, we have someone who specializes in the use of the imaginal within the community. So these are just some of the ways, but I think it really opens up the idea that the sociological demands of this world historical moment place a normative burden on metapsychology to move forward towards something that is like a simultaneously futuristic and archaic shamanic attractor.
Nice.
So I could go in any part of those, but I'm obviously I want to know from Gregg that apart from speculating about shamans, like what's your hunch about what the general type of Gnostic intermediary or metapsychologist would have to be like, so that it maximizes our chance of thriving into and through the meta crisis?
Well, first off, that list, I would encourage people to hit pause and go back to that thing. That's a really, really tight and a powerful list of correspondences of where we are, what we're missing, and what we might afford. I'm also thinking about sort of Lene Rachel Anderson's meta-modernity model of pulling from the strengths of various cultural sensibilities and finding in the shaman priest kind of notion an archetype and you delineating what its needs are. And then also the need to say, no, we're not going back to that in and of itself, but we actually have to place it in this prehistory looking forward. And then how the hell do we do that? And that's certainly definitely part of my own search right now in relation. I gave up my license to be a clinical psychologist, in part because I think we need a metapsychological physician that's outside the clinic room, but is in relationship to where the societal forces are right now. What are our knowledge and wisdom forces, and what kinds of things do we need? And then I think we would need a wide variety of different, leading figures that form a nexus of an integrated pluralism, that would then meet the various listings that you engage. So where I feel like I position myself is coming from behavioral science tradition and then anchored to a particular naturalism. I can line up now a coherent natural science with psychology and all of its various flavors into a wisdom philosophy and create a logos architecture that I don't think was previously available, that affords a descriptive metaphysics that can ground us in a sort of psychogeometry that's more clear at the logos level. And I can bring that. But there are many, many other embodied practices, many other kinds of, if I think about, say, Greg Thomas's knowledge of jazz, any other kinds of pathways that would afford the system to get in touch with whatever layer of the psyche that we need to be tapping in, whatever kind of rooted cosmological dynamics that we're replenishing. There'd be huge numbers of places for certain kinds of shamanic leadership that are playing slightly different notes, but all would then be potentially a resonant frequency that would afford us a conscious awakening that was like, shit, we got to wake up and write the prehistory in a pretty different way than the current Titanic.
Nice.
In some South American traditions, they make a distinction. This is coming from Alberto Villoldo, who is a little bit more on the New Age end of the integration of psychology and indigenous wisdom. But he talks about basically the shaman working at 4 different levels, at the level of the body, the level of the mind, the level of the soul, and the level of the spirit, those familiar categories. But the shaman ideally works most closely at the level of the spirit of energy. And it's felt that you can't really very effectively facilitate healing at the same level at which the wounding originated, that you need to be able to encompass it from a higher perspective. And so working at the level of the body, obviously you're paying attention to nutrition and health and breathing and different physical relationships and behaviors. At the mind, you're working at the level of narratives and systems of justification and rational beliefs and irrational beliefs, and you're working at that level. At the level of soul, you're working at the level of images, of dream forms, of archetypal forms, of symbols that can encompass more in a compact and embodied way than simple narrative streams that you can take into your body and feel it, and it actually helps things reorganize you within you in a particular way when you're able to hold that particular symbolic form. And interestingly, the early root of the meaning of the word symbol has to do something with like a compact, a covenant, a connection between self and other, between self and world, really, that establishes a sacred relationship. And so symbol can form, or symbol can serve that role. Jung distinguishes between signs, which simply point to something, and symbols, which are in essence infinite. They keep yielding new possible meanings because the strands of relationship out to the larger world and to the inner psyche are so massive. So that's the level of soul, and that the level of spirit is basically working with energy, in the individual, and shifting states, shifting energy flows, facilitating ecstasy, facilitating deep whole body, release through the shaking practices that you can find in many shamanic cultures. But there's also intensive psychedelic journeys and other things can really reorganize things at the level of energy, and that's where the shaman wants to work mostly. Is there? There's Anne Klein is a Buddhist scholar and a psychotherapist who talks about energy as being kind of at the liminal zone, that boundary between our meaning making systems and kind of higher formless sacred territories, and whatever, however you imagine that, whether post metaphysically and secularly or mystically and religiously, but that the level of energy can facilitate changes within the system in a much more rapid and thoroughgoing way than verbal verbal techniques or even imagistic techniques. And this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's relevant. And actually, one day I'd love to explore the diamond approach with you, Greg, in relationship to UTalk. We might get into that later. Okay. But here's an example that Anne Klein talks about from the diamond approach. I did diamond approach like 6 years of therapy with diamond approach practitioner, and I can testify it's a really powerful way of working. But one of the methods in diamond approach is to discover where the holes in our being are. And you discover holes. There's like a field of essential qualities that are part of our human makeup and inheritance. And through different traumas, object relational disjunctions and things like that, we lose contact with some of those qualities and resources in our being. And those are experienced phenomenologically as a whole, as a gap, as a point of longing, as a feeling of something missing or inaccessible. And so there's a practice of discovering where those holes are and working with them. And so there was a example of a woman who was working with a diamond approach practitioner, and they discovered this hole in her heart center. And as they went more and more deeply into it, she found that this is where she experienced her mother's words as a knife plunging into her chest. The words of rejection, the words that basically did not accept her in her own being. And it was showing up as a whole in terms of phenomenological space. Right. And so within diamond approach, you merge with the whole. You get curious about the whole. You go into the whole, and you don't have to think about anything. You don't have to try to narrate it or interpret it. You get feelingly into that space. And when you get feelingly into that space, that the whole transforms into spaciousness, into the holding patterns are loosened, and there's something else can happen. So in this case, the woman who was entering into that hole in her center, she suddenly felt this eruption of this golden, luminous, honey-like energy that just flooded out of that hole and filled her body with a whole chemical flood. Right. And then later they went through it, and they actually have diamond approach ways of interpreting what happened. But that actually facilitated for her a really deep release and reintegration of a lot of material that happened at a completely different level than narrating it out or interpreting a dream. And so that's an example of the working with energy that the shaman wants to do. Love it. And it's not just, I would say it's not just metaphysical woo-woo stuff. No, definitely. Yeah, I think it's just another level of working that requires anchoring in some of those other levels. in terms of the verbal understanding and the relationship to culture and to how you integrate it and hold it. But that if you can contact that level in the individual and help facilitate that kind of shift, and I know we can find examples of that in some humanistic practice and Gestalt and other things, but it's not really. I think that the whole shamanic container, with all of the different attributes that the shaman has, that Layman so beautifully illustrated, I think that really gives us a great archetype for holding that process.
I'll just jump in real fast. I know you go, Layman, but that's beautiful. And certainly, so, I mean, for me, I'm tracking vertical integration in the psyche, and I do it in the following 4, very similar, but body. So that's your old animalistic safety issues, fucking, feeding, and then pleasure, pain, and basically proprioception of the body and interoception awareness. Then you jump up into heart. That's relational attachment mapped by the influence matrix. So you basically pride, shame, love, the self other world matrix that we get born into and then track. Okay. Then mind 3, justifying, and then spirit in relationship to transcendent egoic kind of concerns. And the whole point is, yes, there's a vertical disintegration, horizontal conflict, and developmental trauma that then create all sorts of static. And my strength was then to build a, psychological mindfulness COM-MO narrator that afforded these sort of egoic logos that says, hey, yeah, you want a sage up here that's curious, accepting, loving, and motivated toward valued states of being. So you drop the COM-MO flashlight. But my weakness has always been the embodied, participatory, perspectival energy practices, that would drop from put the person in the healing ritual itself, and then live out that ritual at the Gilchrist right hemisphere level, right? And that's what shamanic practice is about. So it's a beautiful opportunity for a complementary, kind of a more holistic healing frame.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I get 2 things sort of stood out to me, Bruce, from what you were saying. One is the concept of reorganization, and one is this notion of levels, particularly energetic. So reorganization actually is, I've been thinking a lot lately in terms of self-reorganizing systems rather than self-organizing systems, as a way of talking a little bit, because there seems to be, there's a lot of self-organizing systems, and we get right up to the point where we're going to start calling someone a justified self-aware organism of some kind. And it's taken the fact that it's a self-organizing system into its identity at that point. And then you have these steps or grades or styles or whatever of human beings who are much more self-reorganizing. We tinker with ourselves constantly. And the idea we talked about last time about getting up to a kind of integrative pluralist, full spectrum platform that can open up other things for us, but basically that's where we want most people to get to. It's almost like that takes self-reorganizing system into its identity.
Totally.
Right? In a similar way that we might say that there's a development towards systems that identify themselves more as developing systems. And that's afforded to beings that have more developmental opportunity. Like crows are real smart because they have long extended childhoods like we do. We've got a really long one. We've got one that's so long we might be able to identify developmentally changing as essentially what we are. So I think there is a convergence toward the self-reorganizing system as the identity. And I see that in the shamanic rituals. I see that's the ancient Dionysian tale too. He's torn apart and put back together. And then that's our fun. That's the basic underlying myth of what this platform has got to be like. And I think Nietzsche was onto that.
Actually,
go ahead.
Just real quick, because it's just coming off an early supervision I had with a doc student. Okay, so she's today, without divulging anything, but it's a doc student who's committed certain kinds of ideologies, progressive ideologies, say there really aren't any differences between men and women or whatever. And then she's learning U-Talk, and U-Talk says, maybe, okay, at the animal mental level, and maybe there's an ideology that's being advocated out of good justice concerns, but basically a lot of where that comes from is a moralistic ideology as opposed to, sort of a scientific, and then the whole point was actually part of what I hope to see is you to see yourself as a justifying animal and then just get adjacent to it and say, isn't that funny that that's what we do? And let's see how we evolve. And she was like, oh yeah, okay. And so anyway, it was literally the process of seeing and then feeling and then metacognitively and then building an adjacent observer and then being on for the journey in sort of an accepting, fun place. And so anyway, it's just very much alive in relationship to that.
Great. And the other thing I was saying, I noticed in Bruce's thing is this notion of these levels, and there's different ways to talk about those levels, because, you know, when I think about energy, and I want to like bracket the ontological question of what energy actually refers to, there's different ways to go with that. But I think that the fundamental thing that's implied there is, you know, the first developmental scheme I ever learned was Timothy Leary's scheme back in the day, right? And he called it the neurosomatic circuit. He said it was the unlocking of the lower just survival circuits, so that you're having a conscious recognition loop installed in addition to those physical processes. And now you're interoception and proprioception because something that you're consciously aware of as part of your identity. And that's where you're picking up vibes and tingles, and you've got this ability to read situations and yourself and the world slightly differently. So that seems essential, but also it seems like the shaman, like you were saying, the 4 levels, could be 7, could be 12, whatever it is. We're talking about a healer who's at least open to operating on all those levels. They may not be able to specialize in all those levels, but in principle, they stand for treatments in all those zones. And those treatments are, let's say, conservative and liberal, right? There's a troubleshooting, there's a restorative mode to self-reorganizing, and there's a transformative, changing, mutational mode to self-reorganizing. So the shaman has to be able to handle both of those, because maybe you just need to be restored and maybe you want to be changed.
Right.
And when it comes to energy, you know, at least metaphorically, there's this convergence between energy and health, like a generalized notion of vitality or something like that.
Sure.
And very often the symbolic way that's presented with the shaman is there's an elemental mandala, and then there's this other, you know, the chi or the prana or the life thing itself in the middle. And in order to make a more advanced version of shamanism, we have to be able to think through pretty clearly what we mean by that thing. What is vitality? What is health? What is organizing the elemental mandala for us? And how do we privilege that sociologically in terms of how we set things up in society? Because I guess I'm thinking of Freud versus Reich, right? Freud kind of said, look, your psychological problems are your maladaptations to the dominant social system, which is a scheme of repressions to keep your disreputable desires and drives down, and probably it'll end in tragedy as we all kill ourselves. And Reich was like, no, that's maybe part of your problem, but I think that if people were healthy, they would oppose systems like that, and that would be a sign of their psychological health, is their non-adaptation to those systems.
Yep.
So these are two very divergent notions of what basically psychological health means relative to a society. So I'm curious about what both of your takes are in terms of like what health is in almost a symbolic shamanic sense, and how is a metapsychologically healthy person related to society?
I'd like to, were you about to say something, Greg? Because I don't want to cut you off there. Okay.
Go ahead.
One, just on the notion of the self-reorganizing being, I just want to give a shout out to old Sloterdijk, who's drawing also from Nietzsche. But basically his idea is that, drawing from Nietzsche, is that we are practicing beings, that throughout life, he calls us the ascetic species. And by ascetic, it's not world denying, it's practicing. It's the beings that become through the art of becoming. And there's always unfolding dynamic of responding to this vertical tension. And negatively framed, we can think about, this can't go on. It can't only be this. We have that intuition that while things are working, there's also something falling short, something incomplete. And that there may be better ways to do things, fuller ways of inhabiting the world, and that there's always this vertical tension. And it drives us in the arts and in sports and in technology and in psychological development and cultural development. That vertical tension is there, and that we are the practicing species, auto self-reorganizing species. And I think that's a powerful framing And it can really plug us into a lot in terms of integrating psychotherapeutic and artistic and spiritual forms of practice as all part of the same arena of this game of the self-reorganizing aesthetic species. But one thing I wanted to say about in terms of health is just connecting it again more to the cultural side of shamanism, and not saying that that's what we need to therefore put into play ourselves, but as an exemplar of possible patterns and things that we can pick up on. So from the point of view of a lot of, not all, but it's actually remarkably similar, there's the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel basically points in the 4 directions. And this symbol also goes back at least 40,000 years. And we can find it all over the world, in South America, in Africa, in Australia, in Eastern cultures. It's basically the circle divided by the cross. The Greeks had it. But in shamanic practice, the medicine wheel, we can relate it to like a mandala. We can relate it to something like the integral 4-quadrant map. But I think what's unique about the medicine wheel is it's not only a map of the world. It points in the 4 cardinal directions of the north, south, west, and east, and it associates different elements and features of the world and different elements and features of the psyche in all of those directions. So there's the north, which is wind and and the element of air, but it's also where the buffalo comes from. It's also the old age, the winter time. It's also mind and thinking. So it has all kinds of different symbolic associations with each one of the elements. And so it's not only a map of the world that tells individuals where they sit in relationship to all of this complexity called life, but it's a tool. It's an active tool that they use ritually to help the individual discover a greater feeling of contact with all of those domains of being, and to finding their own center within their deep participatory relationship with mind and emotion and body and spirit and value, and with the different elements, with the different animals, with the different herbs, with the different locations, with everything. So it's an active practice that rituals are built around to help you find yourself in living participatory relationship with that full world. And that health basically means learning to walk in beauty, to learning to walk in right, reciprocal, nourishing, transformative, respectful relationship with all of these different elements of being. And that a healer, one of the criticisms that I've heard, like for instance, a Lakota medicine man or shaman making towards the West, is that we tend to outsource our well-being to experts who apply fixes to us from the outside. We are their consumers of fixes.
Yep.
We're not people who are practicing living from our own, center that's related to all of these different domains, and that the shaman is the person who tries to help you discover your living relationship to all of these domains and to live from within the center of the wheel so that you have equal access to all of these dimensions of being and the world. And that states of ill health can be looked at as states of imbalance within that wheel. The person who is imbalanced towards the mental, towards the north, may be experienced as more cold, as lost in the head, as lost in abstraction. And it means they're farther away from the south, which is where emotion and the water element and feeling and heart are. So you can visually grasp, the farther I am over here, the less I have access to this dimension of myself, the less I can basically integrate that and use it as a ground for my own being. And so there's a lot of ways of working to identify where those gaps are. Am I too much towards body indulgence, and I've lost any sense of feeling of values. That's the West and body and earth, compared to the East and the sun and the light and values and spirit. So that's a symbolic, metaphoric way. But to me, it enfolds a lot of psychological wisdom, and it basically gives, I think, a model of health as somebody who lives from the center of their participatory world in a way that they've been able to integrate access to those domains and fold them into their own sense of ongoing growing being.
That's really beautiful. You guys both said a huge amount of things there. So I'll just offer a few and see which ones we want to pick up on. But so one of the things you were saying about the medicine wheel, first off, I completely agree that the healer relationship is the expert does something to you and confers upon you a fix. Certainly our normal biological medicine does that. And I think there's certainly good places for that. Psychologically, that's how we cultivate the right relationship between the internalization of healing for the individual as we afford support and guidance is something I think we're still struggling with to get good relation around. And what I mean by that is I don't think that there's a proper relation between empathy and support and direction and guidance. And I really see the psychotherapy systems as struggling with that proper relation. So there's a number of supportive, and Rogers wasn't really this way, but he gets taken to be this way. It's just basically empathizing with whatever the individual is, affording unconditional positive regard to that subjectivity, and just imagine that somehow is going to then result in health. Okay. And then you have other much more prescriptive and directive issues that have their own versions about, well, what is the inevitable, the psychoanalytic version about, well, we're basically neurotic, so at least you get insight, And to me, the issue is what actually is health. Okay. What is the proper model of health? My friend, a professor of pathology, Waldemar Schmidt, who got interested in the unified theory, but his expertise is in the diseases of the female reproductive system, the liver, and the kidneys. Okay. And what he told me is, Greg, the first thing that we learn in doing and analyzing those things is what a healthy reproductive system, kidney, and liver look like. So that becomes the reference point.
Yeah.
But when we ask, well, what is a healthy, optimal person? And when is depression a proper response to loss and despair, to an unjust society? When is it a neurotic response? What fundamentally is optimal functioning across the body, the heart and emotional system, the relational dynamics, effective justification that's both flexible and adaptive? What's the spiritual, moral, ethical orientation of being in the world? Our guidance system around that is very, very vague, fragmented. People are scared of it. Well, our basic dominant structure is an instrumentalism that says, hey, get a job, make money, and then decide on your own, or return to the weakened religious systems for some kind of guidance. We don't articulate with any degree of clarity, and psychology doesn't articulate with any degree of clarity. Okay, this is human nature. This is optimal functioning. This is the relationship between humans and each other and in nature and technology and the cultural structure. And we have models that afford clarity about what well-being is, clarity about neurotic functioning, psychotic functioning, biophysiological diseases that impair. How do we make sense out of that? We're really deeply struggling. And we need maps and models that afford us. And one of the things I do with both my doc students and when I'm working with somebody is like, what are your values? Okay. On the east side of the equation or whatever, what's our shared understanding? And I engage in a balance of directive empathy. And what I mean by that is I enter into the vertical layers and how they're carrying their histories and their rooted cosmopolitan justification narratives inside of what their heart energies are. Afford them a flashlight that allows the ecosystem to start making fundamental sense about what's going on. And then invoke in them some sense about, well, yes, this is what is fulfilling. This is what is good, and afford some direction in relationship to consolidate that understanding and felt motivation toward it. And so I appreciate a lot of the need to do that. And I don't see, or at least I think that's a underdeveloped aspect and too chaotic and too diffuse in our current states.
This universal image of the medicine wheel fascinates me. It's coming up for us. And I like the way you said it, Bruce. It's not it's not just meant to situate us in a cosmology, but to balance these different domains so that we can figure out what a positive definition of health is somehow at the center of those things. But I'm also interested in, especially in terms of skewing this towards something that's ecologically useful. We don't always want to get too symbolic with these things. You know, I've got a little anecdote in my head, which is I was in the Rocky Mountains and I came down out of this bathing that I was doing in the stream, and there was a ceremony going on, right? And there was some cameramen and stuff, but the dances were going, and these people had these costumes. And then when they finished dancing, the guy took the microphone and he held up a eagle feather. He said, "This eagle feather is very sacred to my people." And I thought, I felt like I know exactly what you mean. And then he said, "It symbolizes vision and judgment." I thought, you lost me, because we've gone from something that's universally human and not necessarily linguistic to something that's just reference to an encyclopedia of associative representations. Now that's useful. There's something real to that, but we also have to be aware of the fact that there's a huge non-symbolic dimension to what we're working in. So when we say, earth and air and fire and water, these are absolutely connected to different attributes. Oh, this is mind and this is embodiment and things like that, but they're also just those elements. Right. So that you want to say, as a therapeutic mechanism, go in the yard and take your shoes off and put your feet in the dirt, or go in the stream, or sit around the fire. Right. We know the sunlight will reset your circadian rhythms. We've got all this Wim Hof stuff about how the cold on your body will supercharge your immune system and help you with a lot of things. So there's a lot of just very visceral, non-symbolic, practical, ecological suggestions for the ways in which we relate to the ecosystem that help regulate ourselves and help establish health, that aren't necessarily in a more socialized symbolic realm, but are very direct, that you have to go out and be in the ecologies in a certain way in order to function as a healthy being.
Yeah, there's an example of that from my life that really made an impact on me. I'd like to tell that story. I don't know if I have told the story on the integral stage before, but I'll tell this one. For the non-symbolic, of course, there is a symbolic dimension of it, but there's also this basic, elemental power of something like the sweat lodge. And, these different ceremonies, they do something for us on multiple levels. And the sweat lodge I experienced like that. I've done it a number of times, but one of the most powerful examples of that was me and several friends decided that we were going to make our own sweat lodge. And so we went out into the wilderness and we started looking for the elements that we knew we needed to make a sweat lodge. I had a book by Black Elk and Lakota shaman that gave instructions on how to make that. And so we were out there looking for the elements, and we remembered that there was a homeless person who lived out in the wilderness named Chipmunk, and he probably knew where all the good stuff is. And so we sought him out. We found him and said, "Can you help us find some big rocks? Can you help us find this kind of tree?" And blah, blah, blah. He did. So we went and gathered all of those things, and we built a sweat lodge, which is, the poles and the covering on the poles. So it's like a covered dome, a tent. And there's another mound up front, and there's the ceremonial fire, and we were heating the stones. We were doing all of that. And as we were getting the stones warm, I looked up the hill, and standing on top of the hill was apparently a Native American man with no shirt and long hair and feathers. And he just was staring down at us, and he kind of waved his hand, and we waved back, and he came and joined us. And it turns out he was an Apache who lived on a reservation, a number of miles away, and saw our smoke and decided to see what was going on. So he came down and he said, "So you're making a sweat lodge?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, "How'd you learn how to do this?" We all said, "Well, we've done one before, but we never really had anyone teach us. We learned it from this book." So can I help you a little bit? And we said, "Yeah." And so he looked around and he pointed out some things that we had set up incorrectly, and some of the symbolic things we were doing wrong. But he said, "Can I guide you through it?" And we said, "Sure, we'd be honored." And so we all went into the lodge, and we went through about a 4.5 hour experience with the stones and with the steam, and he chanted and made, Apache prayers for us. And we did different kinds of rounds of sharing. But anyway, we went really deep into that practice in a way that I thought I was going to die. It actually got so intense at some points that I was thinking of bailing out. And he went out and he gathered some leaves and some herbs and things and bundled them up and said, breathe through this. That'll relieve some of the difficulty. And so he kept encouraging me to stay in, and I did. And when I emerged from that, I had one of the profoundest feelings of well-being, deep, full-bodied well-being that I'd ever experienced in my life. And I felt absolutely porous to the trees and to the world around me. I just felt so deeply opened to the larger earth. I could just feel the tree inside me in a non-woo-woo, in a physical way. You just can walk up and touch it, and you just, I don't know, it was a really profound, experience. I'd been through sweat lodges before, but none of them had really gone to that level. And for me, yes, I can extrapolate symbolically about some of the things, I can extrapolate symbolic meanings and things like that. But to Layman's point, there was such a profound feeling of just deep embodied well-being that dissolved any kinds of mental preoccupations that I had carried in there. And of course, people say go out and run or walk, and that'll sometimes be enough therapy is all you need. Sometimes it does help, but this was a deeper level of that. And I think we don't often engage in practices that really push us to the edge of our ability to tolerate and find the way through to the other side. Sometimes intensive meditation retreats, that will have you meditate 18 hours a day, can definitely push you to those edges of feeling of, absolute discomfort and potential dissolution. But when you push through to the other side of it, there's something so powerful that can happen that doesn't often happen when we set up healing environments that have an artificial envelope or container around them that says you have only an hour that you can do this, and that insurance only allows you to do it so many sessions.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's a fascinating, intense story.
There's what I'm starting to think about now is, I framed it earlier as the skill sets of the shaman sort of map pretty symmetrically to the crises factors.
Right.
But there's also this thing which is just in human beings, which is you can see us trying to get our religion in naturalistic forms. Right. So maybe on the one hand, everybody who's tried to set up a wisdom center that's had some kind of intergenerational staying power, Esalen or Findhorn or anything like those are pretty naturalistic contexts. That's what the people want. And on the other side of that, most people go to nature, go to recreational activities. Let's go camping. Let's go to the lake. Let's have a fire to collectively regenerate themselves in a way that feels, spiritually opening and psychologically grounding. They don't always frame it that way, but that is what most people, given their druthers, tend to do. So it seems like a natural extension of ordinary human behavior to think about our healing and transformation in terms of naturalistic immersion styles of doing that. And to me, that's part of, like, when we began this series, I said, sacred naturalism is the naturalization of the sacred and the sacralization of the natural.
Right.
So I think we should be sacralizing our experience of the natural, because that's where people go for it most of the time. But we also, I think, should bring this conversation back around to science and to unified theories of knowledge and things like that, because there is a very strong analogy, I think, between shamanism taken generally and the scientific enterprise. And I think that the commonality, I might phrase it as in enriching the degree to which our neurological, technological, and sociological patterns map to or reciprocate the patterns of natural complexity.
Beautiful.
Right. So if you go out and you take nature into your senses in various ways, or you contemplate the patterns of nature in various different states, there's something deeply consonant there between the attempt to make better models intellectually of and structurally of how nature works. A lot like saying you are materialistic, right? In the non-pejorative meaning of materialistic, you're embracing the significance of the natural world. They're both doing that. And I was curious from your point of view, Gregg, like what you think. I guess I'm kind of asking what a science looks like that does privilege and underwrite a metapsychology that can be sociologically and ecologically extended.
Beautiful. Yeah. So lots of different associations here. So one, actually, I'll go to mysticism, because there's some, then, the shaman and mystic. I've been hanging out with this guy, Zevi Slavin, who John Vervaeke is talking. He's trained in the Orthodox Jewish tradition and then gets into the Kabbalah and then gets into mysticism writ large. And as I recounted to him the emergence of Utah and what it says in relationship to being in the world, and sort of culminating in sort of this logos into a wisdom energy alignment, a non-dual wisdom energy alignment. And he's like, well, my definition of mysticism is the art of getting in touch with reality, a non-dual art of getting in touch with reality. And essentially then a fundamental grounded meta harmonization of self-world relation. So if that's mysticism, and then we have mysticism and shamanism into what science trying to do, or what ideally science will be trying to do in the 21st century. Okay. And I say that because obviously my critique of the way in which natural science evolved is that certainly at the logos analytic level, yes, we want to get it clear as map. And indeed, the epistemological advances that modern science afforded us, unfortunately, were also structured in a particular way that then undercut aspects of the self-world non-dual grip. What I mean by that, I mean that the epistemological commitments of, say, Galileo into Newton afforded you a removal, essentially a split between qualitative, quantitative, or first person, what I call first person empiricism, then into third person empiricism. And then it creates an epistemology of behavior. And then also you basically get an ontology of physicalism. Okay. And then through Newton, or through a lot of people, you get reductive physicalism. Reductive physicalism, in my view, then is completely alienating from the human soul and psyche. And then that's probably most obvious in, say, a Watsonian behavioral view of the world. And that's tragic. And I think we've dealt with that, or there's been an enormous number of negative consequences that still reverberate through an instrumental capital labor relation and a behavioral view, an evolutionary view of selfishness and desire for self-interest and reproductive and survival. Those things are all, in my view, the science that emerged was chaotic, fragmented, and plural, and very often alienating from the soul spirit dimension. But it doesn't need to be. And that's what, in fact, in the final session of the development of transformation, of metapsychology, that's true to human transformation, where we go through Zach Stein's articulation of, hey, well, we can think about the developmental lines of the human in terms of skill development. That's your capacity to generate mastery and competence and power at the level of effectiveness. And then you have ensoulment, which is basically your heart, depth psychology, character development, denning into the embodied perspectival way of being in the world. And then there of a becoming, better or struggling. And then there's the being transcendent spiritual dimension. So that's his metapsychology. We go through that metapsychology. And then my whole point is like, we want a logos psychological, philosophical, scientific architecture that affords us capacity to essentially justify why that's a fucking good map. Like why that has scientific integrity, as well as sounds good for the element, so from the humanistic side says yes, or the theological side, yes. Okay. And the argument is that we're missing that, or at least we're now on the cusp of affording ourselves a natural science into psychology that's up to the task. Okay. And what I said is I'd been reading Sri Aurobindo, and I 15 years ago, I'd opened his book on a greater psychology, which is really a clinical psychologist pulling his stuff together. So he's a great yogi philosopher. And I opened them like, I can't really get onto this. It's too far away from my naturalistic behavioral science grounding. And it affords justification about vital concepts into mental concepts into higher overmind and ultimately divine that feels outside of the language system that I'm using.
Yeah.
I read it 2 months ago and I'm like, hey, this is perfect. That's exactly what I've been doing. So, and here's the remarkable thing. So I would say, so here's Utah. Utah starts with energy. Okay. So the ultimate common denominator, we can get into the physical, its capacity to do work. But really, what's Big Bang? Well, it's a collapse into a super force, super high intensity radiation energy thing. And then it differentiates into the 4 fundamental forces that then create quantum fields out of which particles emerge. So you get a very clear articulation. People can debate about the ultimate ontic nature of energy, but I would argue it's foundational. Whitehead says it's foundational. Many people now are saying that's foundational. And I think that's absolutely really what physics points to. And then it's out of the energy implicate order, if we want to use a Bohmian term, into the superposition of the energy information decoheres into the coherent matter, 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, massive entities that are then bouncing around each other in a Newtonian sense, and then creating chemical energy covalent bonding shifting. And then you get the material dimension of existence. And then I argue with complexity science, we can then say, yes, there's a recursive information processing communication network that goes to life. Okay. And then mind at the neuropsychological animal level, and then culture at the symbolic linguistic self-recursive justification level. Okay. And then we want to transcend that ultimately. And then we can talk about sociology. If you want to come back to sociology, where does culture go to society and what does that mean? And there's that trajectory. But then there's the post-conventional trans-justificatory state of the sage. Okay. And you talk would then say, hey, find your I quadratic formula for waking up, understand what your identity matrix is, wake up. And then the garden affords the path of the sage. Okay. And that's underneath the elephant sun god, which is the iconic symbol of ultimate divinity and goodness. Okay. So you get this from this exterior scientific view. You align the natural sciences and the subject and the idea of wisdom in this kind of path. You get energy, matter, life, mind, culture into the sage, into the idea of God. Well, then you have Sri Aurobindo, who goes totally interior in the yogic sciences grounded in the Hindu tradition across the other side of the world. And he's like, well, you get energy first, then that goes into the matter world and into the body. And then there's lower vital, and then that comes up into vital mental. And then your mental extends into the mental rational. And then ultimately the sage goes into overmind, higher mind, ultimately supermind. And so this stack, the vertical evolutionary cosmic awareness network that he is looking at from the interior view is unbelievably parallel to the exterior view that Utah affords. And so I'm excited, and why I'm super excited about a sacred naturalism is because we're actually now there's a capacity to build an ontology of natural science that gives the stacking in ways that are unbelievably resonant with, hey, okay, let's take the vertical stack of my body, and that's my animal system, into then my primate system, into my justifying person system, into my spiritual person. We're going to try that's matter, life, mind, culture in particular ways. We can afford ourselves an exterior, interior empiricism, afford a metaphysics that describes that both analytically and experientially, and then does so in a way that says, hey, what is health? What is optimal functioning? What's the optimal relationship of the individual to society, to where we are, and how do we find right relationship with is and ought? I think we're in a place to do that in a qualitatively better, more consistent, integrated, pluralistic, healing way than ever before.
Yeah, there's a lot to jump off of there. That's really great and rich. Thank you. One thing I was just thinking of is something I've mentioned to you before, Greg, of Henrik Skolimowski's notion that basically science has developed what he calls the yoga of objectivity.
Yes.
He's an ecological philosopher, but that it's a really refined art form that we've developed that, while it narrows vision in a particular way, it also capacitates vision and insight in a way that we couldn't do if we didn't set up those restrictions. And it's allowed, really, he would argue, a very, very deep union with the nature of the physical world and the natural world, that we've got deep insight into some of the most fundamental patterns and relationships and processes through that conscious bracketing. And so if you think about it as a yoga, as a yoga is a yoke, a thing that establishes the union with the object. It's a beautiful contemplative path that science has followed. Mysticism follows a different one. It also brackets out large parts of the world, and it goes deep in a particular way. And you can criticize mysticism just as you can criticize science for not taking in maybe the fullest picture of the human experience and human world, because it's only specialized in deep diving in a particular way.
Yep.
And I think what we're talking about here with the metapsychology, with the shaman symbol, is that we recognize these different yogas as, maybe developmentally, evolutionary, necessary channelings of our attention in particular ways to establish deeper knowledge and a capacity for identification and union and insight and understanding of very, very fundamental elements of our being. And that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except being stuck there and then not able to acknowledge, the other domains, if you really try to only interpret things from one way or another way. And yeah, you want to jump on that?
Well, I think I think sort of the yogic of physics, if you want to do that, and the exterior epistemology that Galileo and Newton developed for the material world was great, and Einstein and the quantum mechanics. And we really, I'm a scientist. I love what we did with physics, and it was very proper for that dimension. And with Darwin and physiological and medicine analysis, we get biology on top of that. The trick that I would argue for next enlightenment is that because of its commitment to the exterior epistemological language game, as you get clearly active subjectivities, in other words, as you move from biology into animals that clearly start to have some sort of subjectivity, that problem of consciousness in terms of what we're actually going to, ontologically, when does it come online? How does it come online? And then epistemologically, if our justification is situated in the right quadrants, to use Wilbur, exterior quadrants, and we can't legitimize it from a particular way, we're really stuck. And I would argue that actually that the nexus of a lot of those ontological, epistemological problems are found in the problem of psychology. And so science never really got a paradigmatic handle on the transition. But maybe we can now. Maybe there are new scientific optimal gripping that is emerging through Wilbur, through Vervaeke, through Utalk, through meta-modern visions that could develop into political stuff that says, we clearly have an interior-exterior epistemology that afford us a clarity, and now we can do adjacency and prepositional grammatology and move between all of the things, and all of a sudden get a metaphysical architecture that affords genuine coherent flow around the systems. And that, if that really holds, that's a big effing deal, because I think you can get the affordance of a naturalism and a spirituality that are now in resonant harmony.
No, I think that's right. I think there's a very suggestive element to contemporary science, which implies that it might now be becoming capable of mapping to all the things that it previously left out. And I think a lot of people who are both very pro-science and very skeptical about science aren't quite aware of where it's at right now.
Yep.
And that it is opening up these pathways of pretty close co-mapping between those domains. But when you guys are talking about mysticism and also vision narrowing in various ways, what it brings up for me are questions around state change and trance, which are pertinent to the shamanic domain, but also to the sociological and the psychological domains. And obviously, when we think of shamanisms and state change, it's easy to make the leap to psychopharmaceuticals of various kinds, which is really important, right? And we should get, as a society, we should get way better at handling that.
Clearly.
But at the same time, as much as you can have your perception blown open by the tryptamines in the ayahuasca or the psilocybin, very often I think the shaman's work is not that perceptually radical. right? That we in the West, we're like, wow, we're so closed down. We're going to need to get naked and go to a Led Zeppelin concert with a spoonful of LSD in order to open up, right? And so won't we be surprised when we go to the shaman's tent and he gives us one puff of tobacco, right? Because the very often the state they're working with is super adjacent to normal psychology. It's a half a step to the side, right? Which is very much what hypnotic trances are like. They're not like people imagine a complete vanishing of your consciousness. Right. You're still there. It's just a little bit different than normal. And trance is in many ways the language the shaman speaks, whether it's through drumming or through other forms of focus and spinning, but it's also hugely important to a lot of domains of psychology. And it's hugely important to how we sociologically set up the patterns that we agree to act out on a regular basis as part of our trances. So there's some interesting things to me about trance. And, one is the possibility that it might be a relic of the normal waking state consciousness of our distant ancestors. Another one is that's like the Julian Jaynes version. Another one is, I don't know how familiar you guys are with Osho Rajneesh, spiritual teacher from the 70s. But if you are familiar with him, you'll know that he uses very long pauses. And he described this as a form of dehypnosis. But when he would explain that, what he meant was a distinction between trance with programming and trance without programming. And that normally we socially program each other, whether it's our families or our stop signs or a car salesman selling us something or just our normal repetitive behavior gives us a program. And he was very interested in this idea of pulling someone into a trance state where the conscious and the unconscious are balanced a little differently and leaving them there so that they can. He called it a no mind, and he thought of this no mind as the step between regular waking consciousness and a super consciousness of some kind. So that's intriguing in terms of building higher states into a metapsychology. Is does trance of a certain kind have a role in doing that? And the other part, I think, which is closely related to that for me, is like the implied conceptual structure of inductions. I find fascinating, right? There's obviously simple inductions. You can hypnotize a chicken. That means it's a built-in neurophysiological mode of certain animals, and we inherit that into our bodies. We can be physically put into trances, and we can be the physical state of trance can be suggested to us, right? I can be like, well, your muscles are warm and heavy, and your breathing is slowed down, and your eyelids are drooping, your anxiety's gone. You're like, oh, great. That reminds me of this physical mode that I know how to go into. But there's this other uniquely human thing, which is we can do specifically linguistic inductions. We can talk each other to these different states. And if we examine the set of conversational inductions, it seems to me there's a definite pattern that focused expectancies or intensified adjacencies, right? They're in a moment, in the next moment, we're going to begin counting down from 10 to 1. You're being prepositionally oriented toward a next thing or to take a stance of approaching some significance that has not been specified, right? It's a significance that's not in our justified map. And we're being asked to, I mean, it's fascinating to me if I'm like, you're waiting to see that very important point somewhere inside you, deep in your mind where the essence of who you are resides. And there's an opportunity there at that doorway. There's a mysterious power just for you. And it contains whatever it is, an extraordinary piece of information. I'm pointing you, but all I'm doing is pointing you. I'm not pointing you to a thing. I never give you what the thing is. It keeps being unspecified. So now you are just pointed. You're just adjacent in a sense. So I'm really fascinated by the role that towardsness itself plays in affording us the possibility of a different state of consciousness that can not only get outside our pattern and repattern us, which is sociologically important, but also get outside our patterns and hold us there as an opportunity to go into something that's not the same as justificational consciousness.
Right.
So just, in general, how do you guys feel about the role of trance in both creating and transcending the justified behavioral habits in ourselves and in our societies?
Well, certainly, I mean, to me, one of the big transformations that we need to recognize is the egoic instrumental justifier has its particular role, but we need to figure out ways to get adjacent to it, and all of the sort of the psychedelic experience, the trance experience, transcendent experience. Basically, I mean, the mysticism. Some people define mysticism as the art of killing the ego. Along those lines, so the process by which we shift from the propositional justifying analyzer that's struggling to say what is and ought and reduce dissonance and maintain control through that structure. I think that is a mode of being that we need to grow out of if we are and find the way to the trans-justificatory space. In relation. So then to build the capacity of mindsets that allow you to get adjacent, to see yourself in different modes, to be able to access those particular kinds of modes and to explore those modes is crucial to the kind of psychological growth and flexibility that I think any metapsychology would need to point to that. And in fact, when John and I did consciousness, we joint blog together on the ontonormative of transcendent states, which are related to this. John has a whole sort of cognitive model about how you evolve into those kinds of elements that affords the science that says, hey, and I think if you join John and mine's model of the experiential self, the egoic, the persona, the dissolution of these, the capacity, bring in some McGilchrist, and you will see a narrating structure, a logo structure that says, oh, there's a lot of truth to that. And then we have to infuse the participation, socialization practices that enable people to access them and embody them. So I think it's an absolutely essential part of any sacred naturalism, definitely.
Sometimes I, joke to students that in the West, we've learned to specialize in waking, dreaming, and drunk as the three major states of being.
Nice.
But having lived, in many years in Asia and, multiple different countries, especially I saw it in India and Indonesia, elsewhere as well, but the facility that people have with entering altered states of consciousness like that, and to moving into different trance modes, there's a much wider palette that seems available to these people that they can just drop into it very quickly. And it's part of their overall way of just working with being and processing reality. And I think, we should probably recognize in the West that, we aren't really that limited, and that we do have, some pretty sophisticated psychological knowledge. But as part of the overall culture, we don't really train people or facilitate people to work with trance and with states in the generative way that I think still remains in some cultures. In terms of that prepositional, adjacent, anticipatory move of, sometimes the hypnotic, or the way that Osho, Rajneesh would speak with the long pauses. I noticed that Andrew Cohen does that too. The gaps that are there that pull you in. I was thinking of practices that I used to do from different traditions. I was doing it in the context of Krishnamurti's work, for instance, where the attention is to notice the gaps between thoughts, and you shift your attention away from the verbal flow to those points where thought doesn't arise. And so there's that orientation towards the between. There's an anticipatory quality to it, in that that you're lost in the verbal stream, but that there are going to be opening gaps in consciousness between any of the verbalizations or associations or images. And so there's a subtle reorientation in consciousness towards detecting those things. One of the things that I think it helps facilitate is a disembedment from content and a deeper insight into process of self-world making and cognition, that you begin to step outside of that embedment and allow for another possibility. And I remember, one of my more intense mystical experiences happened when I was walking along a garden path, actually a forest path along the Ganges River, watching thought and noticing the gaps. And I turned a bend and I saw this large black snake slip into this hole in the ground. And just the phrase in my mind was that Shiva knows his bride in silence. And that little phrase just like popped me into a deeper kind of well of non-thinking for a moment. And as it went on, I came over to a field where there was a mound of earth that I sat down on, and it felt like a warm mother's lap. And I saw, as the sun was setting, peacocks gathering and beginning to ascend up to the trees, and the light was just streaming through the peacocks and the trees. And I entered more and more deeply into the gap between thoughts until something just fundamentally shifted in that period, where the whole body was experienced differently and the mind and the ego were experienced very differently. The body became what I think the Buddhists call kalapas, these momentary bursts of experience that feels like champagne, just this effervescent bubbling of flashing in and out of existence, points of experience of the whole body. So the body isn't felt like a continuous thing. It's effervescent, appearing and disappearing. And the mind reordered itself where the verbal stream showed up as no more magnetic or holding of self-sense than any other environmental phenomenon. So the sound of the wind, the birds in the trees, the river moving, the thought of something going through, all of those were part of the whole environmental space, and the verbal center was no longer the center. The verbal thing was just one element in an overall environmental field that contributed something without holding the sense of being a self or being an identity. It didn't stop. So there was a deep, deep sense of well-being that just permeated the whole thing. There was an unhooking from the familiar habitual identifications into a much larger field of participation. And for me, this went on for days, but a friend noticed the change in me and began bothering me about it so much. Are you in love? What happened to you? Who's the girl? What's going on? Eventually I voluntarily left it because I got tired of being hassled but I wasn't trying to do anything. I wasn't trying to be different. It just was different. But I could see that socially, the impact was uncomfortable for people because I was not who I was. Even though I felt better than I had ever been before, I was not something that could plug into the sociological categories anymore of the people who knew me. And so I pulled out of it, and
that's a really powerful narrative. It reminds me a lot of my friend Rob Scott, who I know you had some contact with, but he has this philosophy of the fundamental shift, and he has a pathway to orient toward sort of awareness, the fundamental phenomenological ground of isness, of awareness, without attachment to self, and he's got a very interesting angle on cultivating that, I think. In fact, I have benefited certainly from his own guidance. So there's definitely been moments like where I'm sort of loving being without memory or desire. That's that sort of the stream of thought is just whatever it is. It's not your ego and self-attachment. And the activation of cultivating that, the awe of that, the beauty of that, the love of the experience itself, as a mode, a capacity to be. I have, through him and I know there's a lot of wisdom teachers, but he afforded a very nice way of articulating that, I thought. And then he has identity shifting, which has come back and you have to deal with the real world and generate, it's like you're just completely detached. But that dialectic between, what is the pragmatic, instrumental, social world we have to deal with? There is some ego attachment, but it is also a lensing structure And to the extent that you can be awareness itself and feel the love of that awareness as itself, that's a very, very powerful mindset, and certainly something the West is underdeveloped in terms of its capacity.
Yes.
It makes me think of, Nietzsche has this term, the great health. This is where the transvaluation of values is leading us toward the great health. So it's very similar to saying that there's another level of well-being or psychological healthiness that's available to us. And certainly I can resonate with the experience of those states, and also with the strangeness of the return from those states, where you think in hindsight, why it's like you decided to come out of them for some stupid reason. And you're like, was that really the reason? How does this work? Am I supposed to be coming and going? But what I liked in your story, Bruce, was not only the notion of these gaps, right? These adjacency spaces that open up in consciousness that we go through. And I think that's a very interesting thing in terms of thinking the periphery of the justification systems, because one of the things you find if you try to abide in the space between thoughts, you find a hunger, right? You find something wants to go to the next one. And if it does, it keeps organizing you around narratives that you've practiced. Mm-hmm. And you have to, it's like tolerating cognitive dissonance. You have to be able to put up with that hunger and not act on it, right, to be able to be in that space between the thoughts, so to speak. So I think that's a really important mechanism. And the other thing you were describing was poetic, right? It was your Shiva phrase about the snake, and this sense that there are, let's say, non-conscious, resonant structures between what we perceive and what we think, and we don't know those things, but in setting up these odd juxtapositions and bringing things together that aren't normally together the way a poet does, the way an artist does, that's something also that might afford us access to these other states, right? And the way I think about that is through surrealism, because they specialized in transcending the conscious unconscious gap through strange juxtapositions. I don't know how much you guys know about it, but I was deeply into the surrealist art movement when I was in high school. They'd come out of the First World War and said, look, civilization and common sense and rationality and consciousness led us to the greatest horror ever. So maybe we should be trying to fold in dream and nonsense and see if that does any better. Right. And so Andre Breton, when he laid out the manifestos, he was very explicit. He was trying to set up a more meaningful metacognition to inhabit a hyper reality, a surrealism, by hybridizing linear and nonlinear information processing methods, which we could call conscious and unconscious. And that's really interesting. Totally. It's a really interesting way of thinking about what a next step might be. And also, I think it's very significant because the shaman, inherited by the psychologist to some degree, the shaman specializes in a lot of subconscious material in helping you reorganize yourself and also helping you grow as a subconscious being, not necessarily as a rational knower. Right. And I'm sort of curious about how you guys situate the subconscious, because it's a contested term in a lot of ways. And when I think of this concept of another intelligence in us that the shaman might be working with, that might make poetic connections that are not rationally straightforward. It seems to me like maybe there's three general interpretive options, right? There's the straightforward Daniel Kahneman, you've got an automatic super efficient system that doesn't necessarily make any sense, but it's very effective. It's going to have some huge biases, but damn, it saves you energy. You've got the notion that you might be able to hybridize that with your effortful mind to create another form of intuition that is smarter than system 1 or system 2, but which is still somewhat subconscious in a way. It's an awakened subconscious. And then you have the classic occult colloquial model, which is that somewhere in your unconscious, there's a version of you that's actually smarter than you. It already exists. It's already operative. If you could just figure out how to stop obstructing it, then you could be in communication with this higher or deeper self. So those are maybe the three general ways of thinking about subconscious intelligence. How do you guys think about that? Because it's so essential to both metapsychology and to shamanism.
Sure. So, I mean, from my vantage point, I'm going to basically start with the basic neurocomputational architecture that really would precede and potentially precede awareness at all. And you then have this whole capacity of that system to map the agent arena relationship of an animal, that's fairly basic. Okay. And then I would argue that, so what then emerges at the fundamental base of, experience, the felt experience of being, is sensory impulses in relationship to pleasure, pain, jolting, whether or not your prepositional relationship to the environment is something you want to move toward or move away from. And that the flickering of that intuition then is the feeling states and responding to homeostatic and allostatic in a Antonio Damasio sort of way. That's kind of collecting sort of the wisdom of the body in relationship to that. But it's doing it through a lot of sort of evolutionary, operant, and associative processes that are non-propositional, certainly. And really in relationship to even the capacity of the modeling of the self is not super large. We have to get to there, you got to shift into the mammal structure, generally bird and mammal structure. And then you have this sort of intuitive mapping system that can extend the self in time, have working model memories in relation. And then, but now is this conscious or not? And this really depends on what our reference point is. A lot of this relative to what we humans would be able to talk about is subconscious. This is the experiential self operating in intuition, that if you ask somebody what's going on in relationship, the egoic interpretive justifier generates some explanation post hoc that doesn't know. So it doesn't, the layering of self-conscious narration functions as a default to confabulate through convenient explanations. I mean, this is the interpreter function of the left hemisphere. So I would argue that actually the design of that justifier is where we initially conventionally experience the center grip of our consciousness, but a huge chunk of that is deceptive rationalization, automatic narrating, and then the distance that we have from what's actually going on with our heart, with the self-other modeling, then varies tremendously from person, because the filtration mechanism and the access that somebody would have is then hugely dependent upon their own development and what's afforded them to open up the highway of communication with that process. So do you live in a situation where you're not allowed to talk about that? And therefore you create a hole in the psyche that's dissociative in relationship to that. And then that hole can create a huge amount of potential wisdom, because my mom stuck all of this dangerous, I never should have had you kind of stuff in my heart. But I can't think about how my mom hated me, because if I do, I'll completely, and I'll just say she had bipolar and she was a drunk and there was nothing else she could do. So I won't metabolize that. I'll just work around it. Okay. But then I'm working at a half a deck. I mean, the thing is, now I have to cut off all the injuries to my heart, which would be on target, carry this old debt. So I either will become overloaded if I think about it, because then all this stuff comes out of the closet. Okay. So for me, the whole issue is that the intelligence structure is going to become the coherent vertical integrating stacking that minimizes the static between the various systems and affords flow between them. And then to uncover the wisdom of the body basically is to diminish the holes and the static and to afford insight in terms of what it might be telling you. To do that wisely at the same time is realize that actually, well, that's an animal and a primate, and we do live as persons. Okay. So now my mom's a horrible bitch and I'm going to punch her in the face. That's probably not the right way to go. So the impulses that affect afford us are often very short-term and energized. So it's about integrating what that is, recognizing the intuitive self-other gripping that's operative, opening up the lines of communication, and then affording coherent integration. So it's really that stack layer of into subconscious understanding, filtering dimensions, and then affording good interactive vertical flow and relational flow that affords clear communications across all those domains.
Nice. I love the phrase minimize the static between the systems. That's great. Bruce, you're the preposition guy. I'm curious, is the sub correct in the subconscious? Is that how we should be looking at this?
I think for an aspect of it, but I think there's also like a there's also what you might call the para-conscious and the superconscious. And all of those are unconscious to us. We basically have a para-consciousness, which is, it's a whole set of routines that can function offline, but that allow us to do what we're doing, driving and all kinds of different kinds of social interactions. There's a whole paraconscious field of things that are processing outside of the narrow band of conscious awareness. Of course, there are some subconscious things which I think Michael Washburn is very good at showing how mindfulness practice, if you're really following carefully through attention to different elements of your awareness, of your consciousness stream, the more that you become aware of those things and that you become still around the participation of those things, whether it's metaphoric or not, you could say what's typically obscured in your awareness by the active operation of those things comes to the fore. And there's a steady settling that you can do as you can move through layers to see deeper and deeper levels of what's operating. I think there's different ways that this term is used, but one way I've heard it in Tibetan tradition, it's called black diffusion. And that there are certain levels of mental operation that are present, but even when we clarify those, you can become aware of a cloudy, staticky kind of thing going on even underneath that's not articulated. It's not easy to grasp, and they call it a black diffusion of pre-conscious activity. One thing I was just thinking of in terms of the states and the unconscious, I do think we need to expand our comfort with allowing processing to happen outside of the grip of the ego. I think it already does, but I think we don't really have to necessarily do anything to turn it on, but we can work with it better. Great scientists hammer away at something and then go take a walk, and everything that's been happening offline bubbles up with the new insight, right? But what I was thinking about, and maybe exploring how this relates to the idea that I think you're touching on, Layman, is Charles Tart mentions that we need state-specific sciences, that most of our science proceeds within a particular state of mind, and that there are other states that are available to us. And if we're honest, reality shows up pretty differently through those different states, but we don't. And we only consider the one mode to be the real reality, and the ways that the reality shows up through the other states we think of as not real. But he's saying maybe that's not the right way to approach it. Maybe we can recognize the way that the reality manifests to us through multiple states are different signals, different stations that we can tune into, and that they will afford us different kinds of insights, and that we have to learn how to work with each one of those in different ways, in more intelligent ways, and not bias only one mode, one state of consciousness as the only real way to access reality. So one thing I was thinking about here is the practice of dream yoga and sleep yoga. And I did that for a number of years with a Tibetan Lama. I lived at his house and got trained for a number of years in sleep yoga and dream yoga. But basically, sleep yoga is learning to become lucid in a dream. And there are a whole set of kinds of activities and practices and tests and modes of engagement that you can do in the dream space once you've attained lucidity there. And to me, that's a blending of the waking ego and an access to unconscious processing or subconscious fields of information and the way that meaning is enacted. There's a kind of blending that's possible in the lucid dream, the trained dream yoga or lucid dream state. Once you develop the lightness of touch to be present as observing ego without dissolving the constellation that's there. So you do have to learn a different mode of being, but you can then tune into signals of your being, and I think modes of knowing and forms of organization that are not present in ordinary waking recollection of dream states, or that are not present in even active imagination. So anyway, I just think of that as an example of possibly, something like a dream yoga as a way of drawing nearer to that field of conscious, that domain of our conscious processing or subconscious processing that can yield new kinds of insights and allow us to do different things than we can do in waking consciousness. And then sleep yoga goes even deeper because it's bringing lucidity into deep dreamless sleep. But anyway, that's
cool.
Yeah, very much. I want to point out how close an analogy there is there with the surrealism, which is to say, becoming lucid in the dream is a way of doing a fusion of what we might call conscious and what we might call unconscious.
Nice.
In order to afford ourselves some more elaborate psychological opportunities. Right. And when you were talking about Tart, it made me think of somewhere in Whitehead, he says a similar thing, right? That if you only do a science based on the sober waking state of adults, you've got something, but you don't have a full science of the cosmos. Right. You're going to have to look through all the lenses simultaneously. And, I guess a lot of what we call irrational or unconscious is actually something that's just outside of our socially sanctioned notion of linear representation and association. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to bring society back into this because I know we're probably coming near the end of the discussion. Because cultural intelligence seems like a really open field of study and inquiry. Now, I don't know if you guys read the book Zen at War, but it's a very interesting discussion of people who trained in very sophisticated spiritual and cognitive transformations. But when the war came, most of them were right on board with the fascist war effort and retinkered with their Zen training to make it explain why you should shoot Westerners, right? Because they weren't necessarily practicing becoming more sophisticated about social and cultural domains. So a lot of them fell right into that. Some of them didn't, but a lot of them did. And I think, this pertains a bit to what I was saying about Freud and Reich and the question of how does health mean doing well in a culture, or does health mean something more than that? Does it mean doing well outside of a culture as well? Because I think the shaman stands for that in a way, right? It's not just that you're totally indoctrinated and you get up to this level and you think, okay, now I'm open to being non-indoctrinated. You actually have to have been doing some of that work all along. You have to have been learning how to get adjacent to your identities at each step. And I think the shaman suggests that to us. Right, that you shouldn't be totally identified with any of the things that you or your culture are coming up with. Totally. And we see that, I think, in, some people, Slavoj Žižek has made this comparison between Santa Claus and Jesus, right? That if you just leave a kid alone, he basically stops believing in Santa Claus because he had a minimal distance between himself and Santa Claus the whole time, whether he articulated it or not. And if you've been telling these kids about Jesus or about whatever, and they never let go of it for their whole life, right, something probably went wrong. That's not the normal relationship to a socially explained concept. We normally have this minimal distance. And if you compress that or take that away, there's a kind of trauma, and that trauma might express itself as continuing to believe a thing forever. So I think this is especially important in the internet age because we're confronted by dubious information. And I've mentioned this before, I think, which is the Taoist luxury of being outside of the words. That was great for the sages, but now it's a basic survival skill because you cannot afford to have a 10-year-old kid online believing everything that's coming in, because that's how they end up killing themselves or going down the wrong rabbit hole, is because you didn't already start doing the shaman thing, which is teaching them to be not quite believing in the things that we believe in. Totally. So I wanted to bring that back around because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're getting near time. I'll just offer a few thoughts and then we can see where we're going to go with this for myself. So for me, especially if I, sort of take the concrete vision of the tree of knowledge fairly literally, matter, life, mind, culture, capital C culture on the tree of knowledge are the commitment to these systems of justification. And we can think about the normative operating system is download the system of justification and be a conventional person. And then the relationship between conventional persons and the sage is the capacity, and in this case, then also the shaman, to get adjacent to what convention is, and ask questions about it. And we see this in the normal developmental progression of kids. So kids buy the Santa Claus, and however much they relate to it and whatever justification at first, it's like, well, mom and dad tell you something, then you buy it. And then you get up into adolescence and you really start to wonder, and then you consolidate you individuate some, and then you consolidate. But generally the mode of operation is sort of, okay, I'm going to operate within the cultural convention of justification. Okay. And you may then get some sages that are like, okay, I can get adjacent to this in a particular way and realize the word's not the word. But what you said at the end really is a sort of somehow society, and maybe through globalization and digital, we can afford, I think also, if we afford the right sort of logos and understanding scientifically, bridging to certain wisdom traditions, and sort of all hands on deck can weave this thing together, both at the level of logos, at practice and development. And maybe we'll be able to cultivate a reliable structural centaur, to go back to our other conversation, a reliable structural centaur that affords the socialization into conventional justification, but at the same time knows how to be rooted in one's development and context, be cosmopolitan to see others, and really be adjacent to this whole egoic game, to afford our capacity to plug into a trans-egoic modes of being. And so how do we socialize that? How do we, I think part of the issue would be, hey, how do we make salient shamanic peoples that are affording this perspective as part of the general developmental structure of individuals? Like, where are the priests and shamans that say, hey, this is what wise culture, or this is a way to get reflectively wise for, perspective on your cultural systems of justification. And I think that is the hope, is that as our meaning and mental health crisis, reaches a super obvious level of danger, as we begin to compensate for that, we then will rediscover, say, perhaps one of the things we'll compensate is rediscover sort of the shamanic symbol and shamanic practices and perspectives. And if we do that, I really think that's central to this whole digital, world sensorium age that we're going to find ourselves in. So those are some of the sort of, at least, commentary about society and how we might use this to inform ways we wish society might evolve.
That brings us, I think, full circle back around to the question of the traditional or the non-traditional shaman, because in a way we're asking about whether the shaman is embedded in a particular cultural story or whether the shaman is always outside that story. And I think obviously it's both to some degree, but
he's kind of adjacent. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. Mircea Eliade is the OG Western shamanism scholar. And there's some comments in that work that critique Freud, because Freud put forward a notion in which some of these people might be like psychologically crippled members of the tribe, and therefore they lack capacity, and therefore they buy into the nonsense and superstitions of that particular cultural niche more so than the others. But when Mircea Eliade did these studies, it turned out the shamans are actually usually the most psychologically sophisticated, the most broadly aware, have the largest vocabularies, have the most intertribal capacity of anyone in the tribe. So the suggestion there is this person is the most likely person in a given cultural context to also be able to operate slightly outside of that context. Right. So when we can say, yes, absolutely, shamanism is associated to some degree with particular cultural contexts, in another way, they're always not quite associated with any cultural context. And that really opens up a lot of possibilities moving forward.
I agree, especially if we link it back to Bruce's original point, that when a bunch of shamans from a wide variety of different indigenous cultures get together, the amount of harmonic resonance that they are speaking, there's wait a minute, there is an underlying nature of the shaman in relationship to cultural justification that we can all see and perhaps really learn from. If there really is that place of resonance, that's a nature to super mind above culture possibilities. That is exactly, to me, the kind of resonant value, wisdom structure that would be the guides that we need.
Yeah, I have a couple things maybe throw out at the very last minute, last few ingredients to toss into the pot here. One, I'm feeling a little bit of coming full circle back to an earlier discussion that we had, I think episode 1 or 2, where we talked about Krishnamurti and his culture class, where
Yes.
one of Krishnamurti's famous quotes is, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So there's the recognition that you do need to stand outside, to some degree of the usual, unless you are in a very healthy society, which, maybe sometimes does happen. But that's part of the point of the whole culture class within his schools, is to learn the sources of conditioning as they're manifesting both in the larger media and within the local environment. And so I think that's an essential skill. And it is a kind of shamanic skill, or a monastic skill, where we need people who dwell at the margins of society in order to have deeper insight into society, but also be able to mediate potentials and possibilities beyond the envelope that most people are inhabiting, right? And two other things I was thinking of in terms of like a metapsychology and this whole idea of being embedded in a particular cultural imaginary is, I think meta theory, metapsychology, we need something like that. Maybe not always, but to me, it's a powerful vehicle for perceiving hyperobjects or hypersubjects. We can't see them very readily through one discipline, but when we begin to bring together multiple disciplines, you can begin to perceive the shape of a hypersubject or a hyperobject looming beyond the constructions that are showing up in any cultural milieu, So I think it's a way of gaining deeper insight into, maybe, Western magic tradition would call it the egregore, the deep thought forms that are informing a particular, system as maybe a hypersubject. So that's one piece there. And the other thing about just the position of shamans relative to the culture. One example I had wanted to talk about, I won't go into detail about her now, but is Leslie Gray. She's a psychotherapist, and one of the things, when she was in graduate school training to be a therapist, they watched anthropologically some films of early shamans, and it struck her something interesting was happening that in what they were doing, and she said to her professor, "I'd like to study that as part of my final dissertation." And they said, "No, you can't do that. That's too far outside of modern day," because basically it was only being shown as an example of early primitive human activities that are much transcended by present day psychological practice. So she didn't quite buy that. So she began to go meet with shamans and elders within different indigenous communities alongside of her graduate work, and ended up meeting with them over 10 years until she developed some kind of physical illness that nobody could solve. She went to meet a Cherokee medicine man, but when she met that shaman, she said she encountered somebody who was so much more fully integrated, authentic, grounded, whole, human, humorous, serious insight than any of the professors that she had sat with for years. That this person inhabited a different way of being that was so much more capacious for in the way that he could hold aspects of reality and work with them productively, that she said, "Okay, now I really believe there's something here that I can learn from." And so after that, then she began to she actually had some experiences and ultimately was initiated into the tribe herself as a shaman. But so anyway, that's an example of, she came from the Western context, which just saw the shamanic practitioners as lower and primitive and indulging in myth and irrationality. And she discovered something quite different.
Fascinating.
There's it makes me think of some of my favorite books about people trying to bring Western psychological traditions together with shamanism. I think Keeney's book on shaking out the spirits and Abrams' book on the spell of the sensuous have really been useful to me in thinking about this. You described this woman's appreciation for the psychological integration of this medicine man. And that makes me think of the reasons I've been motivated at times to put forward this coaxial model of stage development, where the complexification and the integration are on different axes, so that we could say it is possible for people at lower ranges of the complexity of the patterns that can be detected to actually achieve higher degrees of integration. It might even be more likely for people in A, naturalistic human living environments, but B, smaller cultural knowledge bases to be able to integrate all the things, because integrating 10 things is easier than integrating 10,000 things. So it may be that there's something that is, more likely to happen at more primitive, quote unquote, levels than it is likely to happen. It could be more impressive if it happens at a more complex level, but it might not be more likely to happen at a more complex level. And I also really appreciated your presencing hyperobjects, because I haven't considered that at all in this discussion. And so, maybe next time hyperobjects and primitive integration.
I love that, because as I heard that, one of the weirdest things about the tree of knowledge for me as a system that affords the capacity to see hyperobjects is that's one way to describe it. I can now see matter, life, mind, and culture through the lensing of that. Those are all hyperobjects. And not only that, it situated me to see the fifth joint point, to be like, oh, we're actually on the cusp of the 21st century, where this digital thing is going to cause some sort of transcendence with culture societies as it used to be, and drop us into some sort of world sensorium organization. And that's going to be weird. So, how's that for profound?
I believe him. He's got the t-shirt.
Hey, man, I drink and I know things. So as soon as we're done.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to explore those things if we want to take those up as themes next time through.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed it. Let's all go have a drink.
We know things, so we're allowed. All righty. Very good.
All right. Take care.
Take care.